Evening, folks. This is The Weird Part, and I am your host, Vincent Treewell. Tonight we'll be discussing the events described by the late, great John Keel in his book, The Mothman Prophecies. Let me start out with a handful of caveats. I am a John Keel superfan. Love Mothman Prophecies. It absolutely blew my mind and changed how I see the world. This is in no way a exercise in debunking. Okay, that's not where I'm coming from at all. But, as Keel himself said, belief is the enemy. And once you start believing that this phenomena is this, then you start to see things that confirm that, and you shut down your open-mindedness towards what else it might be. We should always consider all possibilities and beware of misinterpreting things in a way that fits preconceived notions. Keel himself starts Mothman Prophecies by describing how his trying to use the phone in rural West Virginia in the 60s could have been perceived as a visit from Men in Black or from the devil himself. But it was actually just John Keel looking to use a phone. In that spirit, I want to look at the events that occurred in Point Pleasant and offer a drastic alternative possible explanation. I also have to add that a lot of this is not in any way new material, though it may certainly be new to listeners, because a lot of it was new to me. So I'm just throwing this out here. Take it for what it's worth. No criticism of the Mothman Prophecies, just one possible alternative explanation for the things that so many people experienced, saw, and reported. The three main areas I'd like to focus on this evening are the Mothman itself, a cryptid or at least paranormal being that was described as roughly the size of a large man, apparently headless, with two glowing red eyes and wings, which could fly but took off without flapping the wings. The wings somehow were not being operated like a bird or a bat. That entity is one thing I want to focus on. Secondly, the strange radio and telephone experiences that people reported, which often involved a voice repeating a string of numbers. And finally, the appearance of Men in Black and other strange people who showed up to harass and question witnesses. And all of those intertwined phenomena bedeviled the people of Point Pleasant and the surrounding community in the late 60s. And I believe there is another explanation that covers those bases, and one that I personally find quite interesting. What spurred my interest in all of this was a recent episode of a National Geographic show called Chasing Bear Grylls, where Bear Grylls, the outdoor adventurer, took comedian Michael Key out to do some adventurous things. And when Grylls arrives, he is flying a jetpack. And I can't tell you how amazing that looked. I wasn't even really watching the show, but suddenly this guy comes flying along on what is clearly a jetpack. And so I had to Google, are jetpacks real? And I learned that not only are jetpacks real, but they were developed by the U.S. military back in the 50s. And while the Army eventually decided that they're too dangerous to use, they were extensively tested, and a individually deployed flying apparatus was a thing from the 1950s on. This rang a bell in my head because I knew that back in 2014 there had been an article published in Soldier of Fortune magazine in which a Special Forces veteran claimed that people in him and other people in his unit had been testing high altitude, low opening parachute training. They'd been using high altitude, low opening parachutes to test a certain type of phosphorescent paint that would later be used in the Vietnam War. And he purported that it had been tested in the area around Point Pleasant. And so there had been a lot of Special Forces airborne troops doing high altitude, low opening parachute activities, and that this was the origin story of the Mothman legend. And this was enough, it was serious enough that Lauren Coleman responded to it in some detail and explained why that might have created some sightings, but could not explain the majority of what people were seeing when it came to the Mothman. That while a fully geared up paratrooper might be misperceived by some as a Mothman, that the paratrooper would be coming down, while the Mothman creature was known for taking off straight up and flying away without flapping its wings. And those two things kind of clicked, that perhaps there was military testing of jetpacks in that area at that time, and that would look remarkably like what was described as the Mothman. And here I have to get just a little bit technical into the subject of military equipment and what troops would be wearing while testing jetpacks or high altitude, low opening parachutes at night in that era. In today's circa 2020s U.S. military, flashlights attach directly to the helmet. However, for a long time, at least from the 60s to the early 90s when I was enlisted, the flashlight was carried at about shoulder height, clipped onto your web gear. And if you're out in the field doing any kind of night operations, you always used a red lens flashlight, which is simply a regular military flashlight with a thin piece of red plastic that went over the bulb so that you didn't give off white light, but just gave off red light, which is much harder to see at night and which doesn't travel as far. Now visualize that you have a fairly tall man with a helmet on, wearing 2 red flashlights at about shoulder height. And you might be wearing 2 if you were doing something where you needed visibility among your own troops. And if you were, so this person's, the soldier's wearing a helmet, has 2 red flashlights at shoulder height, and has some sort of individual flying equipment that very well could look like wings, and suddenly takes off vertically without flapping the wings, because he's actually using a jetpack. What would that look like? Well, it would look a hell of a lot like what people reported as Mothman. That's not to disparage anybody. That's not to debunk Mothman. But that's just to offer one possible explanation. That would look so much like the headless, burly, red-eyed, flying but not flapping creature that people describe, that it's at least, to me, food for thought. I mean, just try to visualize what that would look like, especially if you see it by surprise in the middle of the night. Yes, I think that could pass for Mothman. And I don't know what the military might have been doing with some form of jetpack at night in rural West Virginia. That's the kind of thing you're never going to get proof on and you're never going to get answers on. But do I think it's a possibility that that's exactly what was going on? That some unit of the U.S. military was literally flying around with jetpacks and perhaps some sort of jetpack glider combo that they were either testing or using to test something else. And that the 2 red eyes are indeed 2 red flashlights. I think that's a possibility. The second prong of the weirdness that was going on in Point Pleasant in the 1960s is anomalous telephone and radio transmissions that often consisted of a person reciting lists of numbers, often in a foreign accent, and just going through what seems like random digits. And this is certainly weird, but as I looked into the phenomena of number stations, I learned that this definitely was, and to some extent still is, a thing that was being used for espionage. And the high point of its use was the 1960s. And these were usually shortwave, but also other radio broadcasting stations that put out seemingly random numbers, just some voice, some person reciting them, to be picked up and used by intelligence operatives. And that's a verifiable fact. The US, the Soviet Union, other countries used number stations to communicate with their agents in the field for many years. And if you hear it, you come across it on either listening to shortwave or accidentally it is picked up some other way. It sounds absolutely bizarre, but it is simply spycraft. It is intelligence agencies communicating to their agents and using cryptologically encoded messages that are just strings of numbers. However, if you hear that without being aware of that, and I was well into adulthood before I became aware of it, it sounds absolutely otherworldly. I mean, it sounds just crazy. But number stations would explain a hell of a lot of what people experienced in Point Pleasant. The just strangely calm, often foreign accented recitation of seemingly random numbers is a thing that happens. And I think it's a possibility that should be considered without discounting anybody's experience. Just that's one thing that could explain it. To kind of set the context here, if there was some sort of large-scale classified U.S. military operation going on in Point Pleasant in the late 60s, whether it was to test equipment, whether it was to practice tactics, or whether it was a psyop to experiment on the American people living in that area, or something else, it would not be at all surprising if Soviet bloc intelligence agents were very interested in this and were present in the area trying to find out whatever they could. And that would contribute to explaining a lot of the weird activity going on. The wiretapping, the number stations, or what could be number stations, and the third main topic, the strange people who showed up, the men in black, who were sometimes not at all dressed as the traditional men in black, sometimes they were, but odd acting, strange folk who appear in the area at that time and have a lot of questions and display a lot of odd behaviors. I think it's worth pointing out that not only the Soviet Union had intelligence agents. Poland and Hungary and Bulgaria and all of the Warsaw Pact countries had intelligence agencies. And not all intelligence agents are going to be the smoothly polished KGB pros that they send to Washington, D.C. If you have an agent who grew up in the rural Ukraine and is deployed to find out what they can find out about what the Americans are doing in West Virginia, he may not be smooth. He may come off odd and not be familiar with American ways. And I'm thinking of the incident in Mothman Prophecies where the guy shows up and doesn't know how to eat Jell-O. and he's purporting to be a U.S. Air Force officer. He's almost certainly not. And he doesn't know how to eat Jell-O. And that just strikes me as one explanation is he's not from the United States and may never have seen Jell-O before. And that, to me, is a possibility that should be considered. That sometimes foreign agents really are foreign agents. And there may have been a bunch of them lurking around Point Pleasant in the late 60s. I tend to think of the phenomena of MILABs, or military abductions, as being relevant to this whole scenario. Sometimes people who have reported alien abductions have also reported being abducted by U.S. military personnel and taken to bases. And sometimes it has appeared that the alien abduction narrative was a cover story for the MILAB experience. And it quickly becomes, I don't know what's really going on. Nor do I claim here to know what really was going on. But I think it's good to keep an open mind and consider all possibilities, including what may be mundane, normal possibilities. And we should just be open-minded. I love weirdness. I love crazy, out-there phenomena. But sometimes it's just a normal thing that happened. And I think we want to walk kind of a middle path between debunking. I hate debunking, okay, just throw that overboard. But between debunking and between blindly accepting that every single apparently paranormal experience is completely not of this earth. I think a lot of things float around somewhere in between. And I think that's just worth keeping in mind. I have one brief personal story which kind of illustrates the point of kind of what I'm getting at here. When I was in the Marines and was going through infantry school, I was doing some guard duty in the middle of the night, and me and another guy were assigned to spend a 2-hour shift walking around, just making sure that everything's okay, and wake the platoon sergeant if anything is going on. And we're walking around and everything's completely quiet. And then we suddenly notice 4 lights in the sky. And the lights circle around and merge into one. And then that breaks into 4. And they circle around and they merge into one. And this pattern is repeated. And we were completely freaked out. At the time, we were both seeing a UFO, or UFOs, 4 of them. And we had a rather tense conversation. Should we wake him up? I mean, do we really want to go and wake the platoon sergeant and tell him that we're seeing UFOs? And we said, well, we have to. But then, well, let's just look at him for a second. And we spent a couple of minutes looking at these UFOs. And then we realized that they were the reflection of airfield lights off of some thick clouds. And that if you got to the right perspective, the right point where you could stand and look down on where the airfield was, yes, there were very clearly airfield lights reflecting on heavy cloud coverage that was out that night. And once we're 100% sure that what we were seeing was the rotating lights at the airfield and not craft, then we finished our post and went on our way and didn't wake anybody up. But if circumstances had been different and we'd only seen it for a brief moment, it would have been a UFO experience. And that's not to take anything away from millions and millions of people around the world who have had legitimate, unexplained sightings, often of which are way beyond just seeing lights in the sky. Though, under the right circumstances, that can be totally bizarre. I'm not taking away anything from anybody else's experience. It's just to point out that sometimes there are misperceptions, and sometimes the human mind misinterprets what is seen. And it's just something that I think we should be aware of. So, in conclusion, just let me wrap it all up. I think it's possible that at least some of the events described in the Mothman Prophecies may have been the intentional or unintentional result of one or more secret military operations. That the Mothman cryptid may in fact have been U.S. military troops using an experimental jetpack with glider type wings or something of a very similar nature to do vertical takeoffs and to fly. And that the headless appearance of the Mothman may have been a result of a troop wearing heavy equipment and 2 red flashlights being perceived as 2 glowing red eyes. And that using red flashlights at chest height for nighttime operations was not at all unusual for decades in the military. And when a person is suddenly confronted with this image, and that being suddenly vertically flies away, it is not hard at all to understand how something like the Mothman would be perceived. Likewise, the repetitive recitation of numbers may have been an intentional or unintentional effect of espionage operations, and the appearance in the area of strange looking, strange acting, but definitely human people may have been foreign intelligence operations. Also, the entire episode, the entire Mothman crisis that happened in the late 60s may have been a government psyop for any number of reasons, testing how people would react. And all of that kind of fits together for me. That's only one possibility. Doesn't explain everything, but I think it's something to think about. It's food for thought. On that note, this is The Weird Part. I'm Vincent Trewell. Thanks for listening. Good evening.